Producer Ben Sprecher anxiously paced around his office in New York City, waiting for another email update from his business liaison, Mark Houghton. Earlier in 2012, Sprecher had been confident that his first major Broadway production, Rebecca the Musical, was going to set the theater world on fire. The original production of the show had proven to be a global smash, and, following a disastrous interpretation of his musical Dance of the Vampires, librettist Michael Kunze was ready to finally have his creative vision faithfully translated to an American stage. But by July, the production had already suffered 2 postponements, and it was looking like they weren't going to survive their third. A mysterious group of 4 investors, the lead being Paul Abrams, were slated to provide $4.5 million to the production. Many members of the creative team were suspicious as to how these 4 funders seemingly came out of nowhere. Rebecca had already sold $1 million in advance ticket sales, and a cast and crew of 130 people were ready to dedicate a year of their lives to the show. But with only 2 months before rehearsals were set to begin, the show was on the verge of a major disaster behind the scenes. The lead investor, Paul Abrams, was in a fight for his life. Rebecca was less than 2 months to rehearsals beginning, and the show's main lifeline was in jeopardy. During a trip to Africa, $2.5 million investor Paul Abrams had been infected with malaria. Having never met the man, and seeing as the relationship was primarily fostered by Houghton, Sprecher and Forlenza had no direct way of getting in contact with Abrams themselves. Knowing that their entire show was on the line, the duo continuously pestered Houghton for updates. The messages coming out of London were optimistic about Abrams' medical state.
Holding his own. Still in ICU, but okay.
The days would pass, with Sprecher and Forlenza constantly wanting to know what was going on. What they weren't expecting was the next update they got from Jessica on August 5th, 2012.
I'm sorry to relay such terrible news. Mr. Abrams passed away this evening, and the family has asked for your attendance at the services.
Upon reading the email, the color left Sprecher and Forlenza's faces, leaving them looking like they had just seen Paul Abrams' ghost. Frantically, Houghton tried to ease the pair's anxieties, hopping on a plane to London to try to save the show-making deal from falling through. A flurry of emails began between Houghton and Abrams' executor of estate, a man who went by the ambiguous name of Mr. Wexler. In the span of roughly 3 weeks, Rebecca had gone from announcing exciting Manderley-themed giveaways for the show's opening to now seriously questioning whether an opening would happen at all. Following Abrams' death, his 3 partners pulled their investments as well. And once again, the $4.5 million hole reared its ugly head. This time, the show didn't have the luxury of time it had had back in London. With rehearsals slated to begin on September 10th, there was no way the show would fill the hole in time. They had to delay the production. Again. Come September 1st, Sprecher made an emotional phone call to family friend Ron Russo, asking if there was any way they could sue the 3 living investors for not following through on their subscription agreements.
Ben, I don't do that. There are lawyers at my firm if you want me to put you in touch with them. But why don't you give me a call when the FBI comes?
5 days following this, on September 6th, publicist Mark Thibodeau was summoned to Forlenza's apartment, where he was informed of Paul Abrams' death, drafting up a press release that would be posted 2 days later on September 8th.
Important info. Due to the tragic death of one of our investors, rehearsals have been delayed.
Later that day, rumblings began in the theater community following New York Times journalist Patrick Healy's report on the matter on ArtsBeat, an online blog connected to the Times. Healy cited numerous areas of concern, from the lack of a name for the investor to the chairman of the Schubert organization, Philip J. Smith, stating, "I've been around here since 1950, and I've never seen a scenario quite like what's happened to Rebecca. Evidently, the lawyers for the estate seem to be cooperating, but let's face it, there's a short window of time for this to be resolved." To make matters worse, Sprecher falsely claimed to have flown to London to talk to Abrams' estate himself.
What the hell is going on?
The mysterious surroundings of the suddenly deceased investor raised the alarm bells for publicist Mark Thibodeau, as he began getting phone call after phone call from the New York Times, looking to answer the big question. Who was the mystery investor? And did he even exist? To Healy, it was clear that someone wasn't being honest. The question was, who? The ArtsBeat blog post only added to the stress plaguing Sprecher. The controversy was the last thing he needed, as he desperately tried to figure out how he could possibly fulfill the roughly $4.5 million hole in less than a month. Thankfully, business liaison Mark Houghton had a possible solution. A $1.1 million bridge loan would help them at least partially fill the gap. The only thing needed was collateral. Holding such a strong belief in the show, Houghton, Sprecher, and Forlenza all agreed to put their own houses on the line to secure the loan. Once again, the production was close to securing the amount needed to get rehearsals and theater construction underway. But they were still roughly $2.5 million too short. Then, on Tuesday, September 11th, 2012, Sprecher's fortune seemed to pull through once again, after receiving an email from a man named Lawrence Runsdorf.
I read about your production in the New York Times, and that one of your investors passed away. Perhaps I can become an investor and at least partially delay your downfall.
Sprecher was skeptical, but after offering Runsdorf his phone number and conversing with him over the line, Sprecher was soon in an office on 42nd Street, shaking hands with the mysterious man. The owner of a Florida pharmaceutical company sat back and listened to a sweating and panting Ben Sprecher, who had just sprinted halfway across Manhattan to meet him. The exhausted Sprecher passionately laid out the beauty of Rebecca, the success it had had around the globe, and the huge upside potential it had to be a hit. By the time all was said and done, Runsdorf was so impressed that he agreed to take the position of the deceased Abrams and to invest $2.25 million of his own dollars into the production on 3 conditions. 1. He needed to have his attorneys review the documentation. 2. He needed his attorney to negotiate a separate co-producer credit. This would help set forth his additional rights and entitlements. And 3. His identity needed to remain anonymous. Runsdorf had never invested in a Broadway musical before, and if it got out that he had invested the sum he was about to, then every producer in town would hound him. And just like that, Sprecher had somehow filled the multi-million-dollar hole yet again. Meanwhile, New York Times journalist Patrick Healy's hunt for the dead investor continued to intensify, placing calls to many of the crew members involved in the production. With little cooperation from the production staff, all Healy had to work with now was a name: Paul Abrams. Diving into the records, Healy was surprised that for as highly regarded a businessman as Abrams had purported to be, nobody seemed to know if this guy existed. In addition to that, none of the producers had ever met him, and the email account for his executor of estate, Mr. Wexler, had only been created a month prior. Healy was in the risky and difficult position of trying to prove a negative in saying that Abrams didn't exist. His evidence was strong, but the possibility that somebody could pop out of the woodwork was still incredibly high. The Artsbeat blog was one thing, but to run a story in print with a circulation of nearly 2 million people, a wrong educated guess would utterly destroy his reputation. In a bold move, Healy released a front-page article in the New York Times on September 25, 2012, titled, "Rebecca Sees Investor Fade as If Dreamt," in which he detailed the bizarre findings, or lack thereof, surrounding investor Paul Abrams. While the article would send shockwaves through the theater world, the cast and crew directly involved with Rebecca, by and large, dismissed it. They had already signed their year-long contracts. Michael Kunze was relieved that the concepts remained closely tied to the German production, and many actors were ready to cement their Broadway legacies. Anyway, the press had been obsessed with Rebecca ever since Boggess had left the production back in April. So, to the cast and crew, they viewed the article as just another attempt to take down the show, dismissing it as free publicity. There was no possible way Healy's findings could be true. How could an investor just not exist? This was still a question that weighed heavily on publicist Mark Thibodeau's mind, despite being told by the producers not to dive into it. To Sprecher and Forlenza, the conflict involving Paul Abrams was better left in the past, informing Thibodeau that they had found a new investor in Lawrence Runsdorf. Even though the cast and crew might not have been interested in the Patrick Healy article, a certain government agency was. On September 26th, defense attorney Ronald Russo got another concerning call from Sprecher. The FBI was officially involved. And now, so was Russo. They entered Sprecher's office and requested any and all paperwork relating to Paul Abrams. After reading the New York Times article, the FBI was having an equally difficult time IDing the stiff. It seemed that Paul Abrams and the 3 other British investors had been created as a part of an elaborate con, and producer Ben Sprecher was their main suspect. Being a criminal defense attorney, Russo rarely believed everything his clients would tell him, but it seemed bizarre to him that if Sprecher had created these fake investors, why would he have asked for help suing them just a few weeks prior? Russo reached out to the FBI agents, telling them he wanted to go over the agreements himself before turning them over. Combing through them with a fine-tooth comb, the subscriptions appeared to be entirely legitimate. After reading through the email correspondence between Sprecher and the investors, it seemed clear to Russo that the investors did exist. This revelation did little to relieve Sprecher's anxiety, however. He still needed to get to opening night. September 28th was the day Rebecca would officially be saved. The bridge loan and Runsdorf's money transfer were nearly finalized. Kunze had flown into New York City, and an entire floor in the 42nd Street studios was ready to bring Rebecca to life. Down the street, the broad sweeping R maintained its phantom-like presence on the theater district. The $1.1 million bridge loan that Houghton had set up was entering its final stages. Sprecher and Forlenza had both given the underwriters the titles to their homes. The only one they still needed to supply was for Houghton. As the pair raced towards his Long Island home, they both breathed an excited sigh of relief. After 4 years of setbacks, postponements, and delays, Sprecher and Forlenza were finally on track to open their first Broadway show. A show that they both firmly believed was going to change Broadway forever. An elated Sprecher pressed the pedal to the metal to get Houghton's title, anxiously awaiting confirmation from Runsdorf's lawyers that his $2.25 million wire transfer had gone through. Just then, Forlenza received a notification. It was an email from Runsdorf's attorney, Scott Lazarus. This was the moment the pair had been waiting for. As Forlenza began reading the email aloud, their hearts began to sink. The email wasn't directly from Lazarus. Instead, it was a forwarded email Runsdorf had received that morning from a mysterious woman named Sarah Finkelstein.
The walls are about to cave in on Mr. Sprecher and the Rebecca Broadway production.
The email was the last in a series of 3, which were sent to Runsdorf and his 2 lawyers. The first email, under the name Bethany Walsh, was sent to one lawyer on September 25th, stating,
"You'd better read the Times."
The next day, on September 26th, another of Runsdorf's lawyers received a cautionary email in which Walsh detailed the findings of a recently published article from Michael Riedel of the New York Post. The third email, sent from a Sarah Finkelstein, went to Runsdorf on September 27th. It highlighted the same findings, while also sending a revelatory and disturbing message.
The walls are about to cave in on Mr. Sprecher and the entire Rebecca production. It is a near certainty that the man, Paul Abrams, was made up several months ago to defraud other investors as a placeholder to give them a sense of security, as well as the owners of the theater, the Schuberts, while Mr. Sprecher continued to try and raise money. When that money wasn't raised by August, Mr. Sprecher, or someone associated with him, came up with the story that Paul Abrams had died. Mr. Sprecher hasn't been able to come up with any information to prove that Paul Abrams was a real person. In fact, any information he has provided has proven to be extremely suspicious. It is inevitable that the truth will come out in a matter of days or weeks, that the Paul Abrams story was definitively made up. And at that point, there will be charges of fraud, lawsuits, etc. The only reason to invest in Rebecca would be for a tax write-off, or to get caught up in a federal trial.
In addition to the distressing contents, what was more concerning was that it had been sent directly to Runsdorf himself. This meant that somebody knew he was directly involved, and his request to remain anonymous had been breached. And so, on September 28, 2012, Lawrence Runsdorf withdrew his $2.25 million investment. Just 3 days before Rebecca's rehearsals were set to begin. Outside a McDonald's parking lot, producer Ben Sprecher stepped outside his car into the pouring rain and cried towards the heavens. They had lost the funding again. A visibly distressed Ben Sprecher sat at a table in the Olympic Diner, sat in between a rigid private investigator Tom Kelly and an utterly unimpressed Ron Russo, staring at the former stockbroker seated across from them. The emails had made a bold declaration that Sprecher had created the investor Paul Abrams, but business liaison Mark Houghton continued to assert that Abrams was real, going so far as to reference photos of the two together on Abrams' private plane. But Russo had represented the Mark Houghtons of the world long enough that he knew he was full of it from the second he opened his mouth. To Russo, the question was no longer if Houghton had played a role in the creation of the fake investor Paul Abrams. It was whether or not Houghton had used the emails sent to real investor Lawrence Runsdorf as a way to frame Sprecher. As the breakfast came to an end, Houghton stood up and gave Ben Sprecher a hug. Sprecher didn't know what to think. How could this man who had been so helpful and who he had trusted not be who he thought he was? After Houghton left, private investigator Tom Kelly told Sprecher plainly,
"I think you've been the victim of a fraud."
Russo and Sprecher walked out from the diner, driving straight to a scheduled meeting in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Bringing a client directly to a meeting like this was dangerous, because there was no telling what the special prosecutor had on Sprecher. Upon arriving, Russo told the federal prosecutor that they had just come from a meeting with Mark Houghton, to which she responded,
"You did what? Don't you know that's a crime?"
Russo was confused.
"That's our witness."
It turns out that Mark Houghton hadn't gotten his lavish lifestyle from managing stocks and bonds, but rather from conducting a series of elaborate, multi-million-dollar frauds. As Russo looked deeper into the subscription papers, he sent agents to the London addresses listed, only to reveal that they belonged to a slew of abandoned buildings. To Russo, there was now no question about it. Abrams and the three investors didn't exist. And when it came to Lawrence Runsdorf and the mysterious emails, Mark Houghton was suspect number one. Later that day, Sprecher was dealt another blow after receiving an email from publicist Mark Thibodeau, informing him that he was leaving the production.
You've been nothing but a good guy to me, and I know what an incredibly difficult time this has been for you. And I really hope it can somehow still work out. But for my own well-being, I just can't be part of this anymore.
Sprecher understood. But before letting Thibodeau walk away, he needed him to do one last thing. They needed to issue a press release letting the world know Rebecca would not be opening. On September 30th, 2012, Michael Kunze enthusiastically prepared for the next step in bringing his beloved Rebecca to the stage. The day was a great one for Kunze, his excitement for the show growing with each hour that passed. He was finally going to be able to bring his true creative vision to Broadway. Kunze made his way to producer Ben Sprecher's office. The entire creative team, as well as a few senior cast members including Karen Mason and Nick Wyman, had been called to discuss the future of the production. As the team all gathered, Ben slowly began to tell the entire story. He told them about Paul Abrams sweeping in to put in a large amount of money. He then told them about his unfortunate demise that led to the three other investors pulling out. He told them of Runsdorf coming in to save the day, only to be scared off by a series of three mysterious emails. His presentation sounded so ridiculous, there was no way it could have been true. But while the story may have been unbelievable, the end result was even worse. Rebecca wasn't going to be able to open. The news came as a complete shock to everyone who was in the room, especially Kunze. Being a writer on the show, he wasn't interested in the financial side of things, only learning about the controversy with Abrams from reading the New York Times. Despite trying to stay as involved in the production as he could, his show had once again been taken away from him by sources he hadn't been able to spot. In his last act as a publicist for the production, Thibodeau released a blistering press release detailing that vicious emails filled with lies and innuendo had scared off their investment from an anonymous third party, with Sprecher himself stating,
"Why anyone would be so hateful and cruel and would go to such an amount of effort to uncover confidential information is something I am having a terrible time grasping. All that we have ever wanted to do was put on this amazing show."
When it came to moving forward, Sprecher had only one order. They had to have at least one day of rehearsal so the cast could still get paid for their work. And, more importantly, it would give him a chance to try to explain. Going into the day of the first rehearsal for Rebecca was meant to be a time of celebration for producer Ben Sprecher. But now it was a moment of stress-ridden dread. In just 1 week, The show that was intended to revolutionize the theater district had gone down in flames, taking 130 people down with it. The news was especially gut-wrenching for Pace, Silverman, and Mason, as their shot at headlining a Broadway theater in a show they had come to care about so deeply had suddenly vanished. Even though Sprecher, Forlenza, and Blakemore tried to rally the troops with a rah-rah speech, everyone in the room knew the truth. Rebecca was dead for good. With nothing else to do, the cast and crew united in a moment of love and sadness to lament the show they had stood beside for years, and how it had finally collapsed into oblivion. Strangely, in the crowd of bewildered and heartsick faces, there was one noticeably absent. Co-director Francesca Zambello. While everyone else was relayed the news in the rehearsal space, Zambello was informed by a phone call from her agent. Unbeknownst to the rest of the crew, when Paul Abrams entered the picture, Zambello had taken on another project.
I was doing another show at the time because I never believed it was going to happen. I never felt right about it.
A few months would pass, and the cast would find themselves performing at a fundraiser event for the show in Long Island, only to never talk of Rebecca again. Even though the show had no hopes of moving forward, Russo was still dedicated to solving who was responsible for its downfall. Who sent the emails that scared away real angel investor Larry Runsdorf? Who were Bethany Walsh and Sarah Finkelstein? Given the suspicion revolving around Houghton, Russo and his law firm sued him, as well as John Doe and Mary Doe. By suing the two suspected culprits, Russo was given the power to subpoena Google as a way to track down the IP addresses behind the three emails. As Google closed in on the IP addresses, it was determined that both accounts for Bethany Walsh and Sarah Finkelstein had been created during the last week of September. The same week, those three emails had been sent. Runsdorf's identity had been kept close to the chest, and the only one who could have possibly known his identity and contact information would have been someone close to the inside. Someone who, for one reason, whether professionally or personally motivated, didn't want to see the production succeed. Was it director Francesca Zambello seeking retribution against Sprecher? Was it Patrick Healy of the New York Times trying to stop Runsdorf from falling into an assumed trap? Or was it Mark Houghton trying to place the blame on Sprecher so he could make a getaway? That first week of December, Russo finally received the document with the customer who was connected to the IP address. As he opened the report, a stunned Ron Russo took a bewildered step back. It was Mark Thibodeau. Sprecher was floored as Ron Russo sat across from him in his office and broke the news. The person responsible for Rebecca's financial fallout was its own publicist? To one on the outside, it made no sense. But from the inside, it was a very different story. On September 6th, Mark Thibodeau was summoned to the apartment of Louise Forlenza. This was the first night that he learned of Mark Houghton and investor Paul Abrams, being told to write a press release announcing his passing and the rescheduling of the show. Being the fourth postponement, Thibodeau told Sprecher and Forlenza that the only way they would be able to weather the storm of negative publicity would be by being completely open and honest about what was going on. He drafted a press release directly stating that the investor, Paul Abrams, had passed away, and reached out to the duo seeking any information they had about the investor's life that he could include in the briefing. What he got back instead was both producers telling him to take out Abrams' name due to privacy concerns. The move was frustrating to Thibodeau, but in a way, he understood where the duo was coming from. That Saturday, September 8th, Thibodeau releases the press release announcing the postponement without featuring the investor's name.
Important info. Due to the tragic death of one of our investors, rehearsals have been delayed.
This vague announcement, in turn, sparks the interest of New York Times journalist Patrick Healy, leading to his article on the Artsbeat blog and his numerous attempts to get a comment on the mysterious dead investor from a member of the Rebecca production team. One of the people Healy reaches out to is Mark Thibodeau. Thibodeau spent the next 2 weeks approaching Sprecher about his continued suspicions of the dead investor. Every time he brought it up, however, he was told to let the story go, because their money issues were already solved. They told Thibodeau that they not only had a bridge loan being set up by Mark Houghton, but that they had also found a new investor to fill the $2.25 million hole, a man named Lawrence Runsdorf. Still, Thibodeau's intrigue in Paul Abrams and Houghton himself persisted. The fact that Healy and many other producers in the industry weren't able to find any information on Paul Abrams made Thibodeau suspicious in his own right. However, unlike the others, Thibodeau actually had a place to begin his hunt, typing in a Google search for Mark Houghton, Long Island. What he uncovered was damning. The supposedly wealthy and successful businessman had several complaints and lawsuits against him for fraud. Following these revelations, Thibodeau scanned over Abrams' subscription agreement himself. At first glance, everything seemed to be in place, but upon closer inspection, he noticed that the phone number they had written down didn't lead anywhere. It was looking more and more like the producers had been conned. But even after bringing this compelling evidence up to Sprecher, he was forcefully shut down. Was Thibodeau on the trail of uncovering something he wasn't supposed to know? It was suspicious how the more facts he presented to Sprecher, the less inclined he was to listen to them. It was almost as if he were involved somehow. Sprecher was still new to the Broadway producing game. Was Abrams created as a way to entice more upper-end investors? Was Sprecher teaming up with Houghton to make off with the investors' money? There were too many scenarios, but none of them seemed to end well for the show's newest angel investor, Lawrence Runsdorf. Was Sprecher preparing to take Runsdorf for a ride as well? The possibility was one that haunted Thibodeau's conscience. The reason being that Thibodeau was indirectly responsible for the investor getting involved. The only reason Runsdorf had agreed to come on board was due to Patrick Healy's New York Times article in the Artsbeat blog, an article that was only written due to Thibodeau's press release on the death of Paul Abrams. The deadline for the wire transfer and the first day of rehearsals continued to inch closer, as Patrick Healy of the New York Times and Michael Riedel of the New York Post continued to release an ever-growing flood of accusations, including one with Sprecher lying about flying to London to deal with the Abrams estate. Thibodeau became even more confident that Sprecher was directly involved in the con. And so, in the last week of September, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Or rather, into the hands of Bethany Walsh. After creating a Gmail account in his apartment, Thibodeau visited a local coffee shop that had a pay-as-you-use computer to send an email to one of Runsdorf's lawyers in an attempt to stop the deal. He brought to light the same concerns he had found in his own investigations and made numerous references to the Healy article. No response. Thibodeau had only intended to send one email. But off the back of the first lawyer failing to take notice of the concern, Thibodeau ran to a FedEx Kinko's the next day and sent an email to Runsdorf's second lawyer in the hopes of getting an acknowledgement that the message had been received. No response. As the guilt and frustration began to take hold of him, that Thursday he decided it was time to wipe his hands of the whole ordeal, and he drafted his resignation letter. Before sending it, however, his mind started racing about all the possible outcomes. Inevitably, his departure would mean that Healy and Riedel would be all over him to get the dirt that he obviously knew. And the last thing a publicist wants is to become the story himself. holding off from resigning. The stress from not hearing back from either of the lawyers sent Thibodeau's mind racing. And that Friday, September 28th, he decided that the only way he could clear his conscience was by reaching out to Runsdorf directly. This time, Bethany Walsh would take a backseat to a new account, named Sarah Finkelstein.
The walls are about to cave in on Mr. Sprecher
and the Rebecca Broadway production.
Unbeknownst to Thibodeau, Runsdorf had sensed something was awry due to a series of concerning emails his attorneys had received earlier in the week. But it was only once Runsdorf received the email directly that he decided to withdraw his investment. The next day, it was becoming clear the show had no way of moving forward, and following Sprecher's meeting with the federal prosecutor, Thibodeau submitted his resignation email. But before leaving, he made good on one last request by Sprecher the next day, releasing a one-page press release denouncing the extremely malicious emails that had made Runsdorf withdraw from the show. Emails which had been written by Bethany Walsh and Sarah Finkelstein. And just like that, the dream musical that was intended to be a crowning moment for Sprecher and Forlenza, a redemption moment for the brettist Michael Kunze, and a launching pad moment for actors like Ryan Silverman, Jill Pace, Karen Mason, and Nick Wyman, came crashing down around them in a giant plume of smoke. The dream of Manderley was no more. Following the collapse of Rebecca, the pressure on Sprecher was amplified. Not only was he liable for repaying the $6 million for investors that they had already spent, he also found himself front and center in investigations from the FBI, the SEC, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. A series of investigations found that while Sprecher's motives were suspicious, it had less to do with a direct involvement in a con, and more so due to being a panicked producer who bit off more than he bargained for. The investigators realized that instead of being a perpetrator of the scheme, Sprecher was just one in an ever-growing list of victims that had been duped by con man Mark Houghton. It turns out the show wasn't the first to meet Paul Abrams and his three investing partners, as the three had been the same cast Houghton had used in an elaborate real estate scam. The email correspondence, Abrams' two assistants, the executor of estate Mr. Wexler, and the four investors were all inventions of the East Coast fraudster, Mark Houghton. The woman that Sprecher had met, alleging to be Abrams' niece, turned out instead to be Houghton's own wife. And the $1.1 million bridge loan that Sprecher was dependent on never truly existed. The loan company was part of a second set of fictional lenders and companies, designed to lure Sprecher and Forlenza into paying Houghton and his entities $35,000. This was added on top of the nearly $60,000 they had paid him for his trips to London and other dealings with the production. In 2016, Mark Houghton would be sentenced to more than 11 years in prison for nearly 2 decades of fraudulent activities ranging from 1995 to 2012. He wound up only serving 3, and as of 2020, he's traded out his sleek suit for a blue polo, becoming a car salesman at a Long Island Volkswagen dealership. All the while, the show's former publicist, Mark Thibodeau's life had become one dominated by paranoia and a constant need to look over his shoulder after the impact of his actions came to light. That same month, Thibodeau was ultimately served with a lawsuit from Sprecher and Forlenza for defamation and breach of contract. Even though Thibodeau had taken great care to send the emails from discrete locations, what he wasn't counting on was that Google not only traced where the emails were sent from, but also where the accounts were created. This meant that all roads led back to Thibodeau's apartment. The case would sit in limbo for years. All the while, Sprecher and Forlenza desperately kept announcing new show dates and inevitable delays when the duo officially lost access to the rights. And just like that, the last piece of hope for the duo bringing Rebecca to the Great White Way had vanished. While the tale of producer Brent Sprecher would continue to intensify and take a disturbing and triggering turn in the years that would follow, that's a complicated story for someone else to tell. The story of Rebecca the musical would officially come to an end on May 10th, 2017, when Mark Thibodeau would be sentenced to pay a total of $90,000. Still not nearly enough to even make a dent in what Sprecher and Forlenza owed to their investors. So what is the legacy of Rebecca? Despite never making it to Broadway, the show continues to be a smash hit, with productions around the world, and it remains a personal favorite of creator Michael Kunze. Whether or not it would have set Broadway on fire during the early 2010s remains to be seen. But there's no denying that its scandal-laden history made it a perfect fit in a Broadway season that was ripe with drama. What makes the story just as compelling nearly 10 years later is thanks in large part to how it shines the light on how the financials of a show can make or break a production. While many shows on Broadway can attribute their undoing to a lackluster score or a flimsy story, few fail to highlight the ruthlessness and unforgiving nature of Broadway politics and economics. The show had a proven track record around the globe, but its failure to launch in America was due in large part to greed, poor planning, and an overall lack of trust amongst the team. While Hadestown had been a celebration of overcoming the odds through a beautiful 13-year collaboration, Rebecca was an 11-year nightmare that serves as a stark reminder that the almighty dollar can sink even the surest of bets. It was the naive, yet inspiring optimism of the entire production that kept attorney Ronald G. Russo involved for as long as he was. He had been so taken with the promise that the show represented that his client became more than just Ben Sprecher. His client was Rebecca. In addition to being one of the biggest scandals in Broadway history, it's important to remember that underneath the headlines is still a group of human beings, many of whom were robbed of a potentially life-changing moment due to the actions of a few. Rebecca is suspense. Rebecca is revelation. Rebecca is heartbreak. And even though the production collapsed with the fiery embers of Manderley, the legacy behind the scenes will continue to live on. In a story filled with twists and turns that would have made Daphne du Maurier and Alfred Hitchcock themselves shake their heads in disbelief.